Welcome, sir. We are happy to uh, host you as one of our distinguished guests for today's lecture. To begin with, I would like to introduce our today's speaker, uh, Nizamuddin Ahmad Siddiqui Sahab, who is a senior research fellow and PhD candidate in international law at Jindal Global Law School, OP Jindal Global University. His PhD seeks to explore the Sharia praxis in international law. Before joining PhD, uh, Mr. Nizamuddin taught international law at NUJS Kolkata and Aligarh Muslim University, Murshidabad campus. He is a product of South Asian University and Aligarh Muslim University. His research interests include law and religion, law and identity, and legal theory. With this brief introduction, I would once again welcome you and request you to begin today's lecture. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Dr. Shuja, for this beautiful introduction, and thanks to the Association of Indian Research Scholars, specifically to Ms. Ariba Ehsanat Muazzam for inviting me for today's talk, and of course, uh, my friend who is a colleague of Ariba. She also helped me in this process. So Afra Salim. So the topic that I have chosen for today's talk is the role of international law in the construction of minority identity in India. I hope to cover the talk in a little more than an hour, and then I will be open for questions and answers. In fact, I would love to have question and answer session so that we can take the discussion forward. I'll use a PPT because that is more. What usually happens is when you interact with people in the physical environment, you can grab their attention. The reason is you have your physicality present and they have their physicality present. But in online mode, it usually does not work that way. So I usually do not like using PPTs, but unfortunately I will have to use it today because otherwise the audience would might not be able to connect to whatever I am speaking. So I'll just share my screen. Just let me know if the screen is shared. Is this visible to the audience? Ariba, Dr. Shuja, is this visible? So, yeah, Ariba, is the screen visible?
Yes, sir, it is. Please continue.
Okay. Thanks, Ariba. Thanks. So, this is what I'm going to discuss today. It's how is it happening? Oh, let me share it again. There was some issue with it. Okay, let me share. Yes. So the topic is the role of international law in the construction of minority identity in India. I'll begin from the fundamentals. And the fundamental is an understanding about the liberal constitutional democracy. Now, I am using the term LCD. Please don't buy it beyond this conversation, because LCD is an abbreviated form of certain explosive, if I'm not wrong. So don't take it otherwise. So, what is a liberal constitutional democracy? Of course, it's a combination of liberalism, constitutionalism, and the democratic form of government, where liberalism talks about individual liberty and talks about individual as an end in herself, which means the individual has to be protected, her freedom has to be safeguarded, any prohibitions on her enjoyment of freedom should be curbed. So that is the understanding of liberalism. And one of the fundamental understandings of liberalism is, for instance, right to speak, or freedom of expression, the right to property, human dignity, and many other things, human autonomy. They all come from liberalism. Constitutionalism actually safeguards the rights of the individuals. So if you look back to the social contract theory of John Locke, specifically John Locke, because Locke is very important in this context, because he is one of the biggest names in liberalism. And number two, he talks about the right to property, which is one of the fundamental principles of the liberal thought. So, liberal constitutionalism, if you look at the social contract theory, the liberal constitutionalism would try to safeguard the rights of the individuals, and how it would safeguard it by appealing to the touchstone of equality and non-discrimination. Now, I'm not saying that there is nothing more than this. There is, of course, more than this. When you talk about human dignity, when you talk about human freedom, when you talk about human autonomy, of course, it is there. But when you talk about state and individuals as subject of the state, the touchstones of equality and non-discrimination become important. And liberal constitutionalism safeguards both of them through the agency of law. So that's what liberal constitutionalism is. Now, I'm deliberately using the term liberal before constitutionalism. The reason is there are many forms of constitutionalism. For instance, if you look at the Middle Eastern countries, if you look at Iran, if you look at Egypt, if you look at Libya, in Iraq, in recent times, these countries have been working on their constitutions. Of course, Iran a little earlier, in late 1970s and early 1980s, but these countries have been working on their constitution, and their idea of constitution is understood as uh, Islamic constitutionalism. There is a wonderful work by Momin Gauda on this point. So if you are interested, you may see that as well. Democracy actually gives shape to the ideals of liberalism and constitutionalism. Now, democracy tells how the structure is to be created. So it decides, the concept of democracy actually decides that majority is going to is going to have their say in the actions of the state, or in the way the state is going to behave. So if you look at liberal constitutional democracy, a liberal constitutional democracy is where an individual's identity is paramount. Number one, the individual is protected against non against discrimination, and his equality is protected. And apart from that, the decisions are taken by majority. So this is a liberal constitutional democracy. I'm discussing this because this is fundamental to understand the minority identity, as we shall discuss today. Now, next comes the understanding of identity in a liberal democracy, constitutional democracy. In a liberal constitutional democracy, the identification of an individual is established through nationality and through the conferral of citizenship. Now, I'm using both the words and I am deliberately distinguishing them from each other. I'm deliberately using them as if they both have different meanings. A number of scholars have given their opinion on nationality and citizenship. Some of them say that citizenship is the evidence of nationality. Some of them say that nationality and citizenship, they can be used together. I personally follow the interpretation which says that nationality is the link of the individual to any group. So that is what nationality is. And citizenship is the status that you get from the state, which means that in sometimes you may have sometimes nationality might mean something equal to citizenship, and sometimes nationality may mean something different from citizenship. So nationality means belonging to a group. Now the group may be territorial, may be based on any linguistic, religious, whatever it is. And citizenship is something that the state gives. Now, I'm not, when I say nationality is based on the identification with the group, I'm not saying that there cannot be a national identity. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, if the national identity is a homogeneous identity, if you're able to homogenize the identity, then perhaps your belonging to that identity makes you a national of the state. Now, in liberal constitutional democracies, this is what is done on purpose to homogenize the identity. We shall discuss that as well. Now, individual rights are sacrosanct and receive protection against the overreaches of the state. So that we have already discussed. Now, the exception, a very interesting exception is the right to property in India, which was a fundamental right earlier, but then it is not a fundamental right anymore. Now, it is very interesting that one of the propounders of liberal democracy, John Locke, he talks about the right to property. In fact, it's the right to property, that is developed by John Locke, where he says that everyone has a share, or everyone should have title as to one's labor. So whatever you produce, it will be yours. So that's the idea. And interestingly, over the intellectual property rights is also based on this very idea. Interestingly, India being a liberal constitutional democracy, the right to property does not exist as a fundamental right. And then in a liberal constitutional democracy, the group identity is protected collectively as well as individually, but upon the whims and fancies of the court. Now, upon the whims and fancies of the court, what does that mean? John Matthew, who teaches at General Global Law School, it's a very interesting article in the Economic and Political Weekly. He gave examples of two instances wherein in one case the court said that the group is a Hindu. In the other case, the court said, no, you are not a Hindu, even if you say you are. So the group identity is depending upon the whims and fancies of the court. That is not very clear. It's a very dynamic element here. And then the minorities in a liberal constitutional democracy that receive protection as either linguistic minorities, as language speaking particular language, religious minorities, cultural and ethnic minorities. So they receive protection under these categories. Now, interestingly, the religious minorities, they do not receive protection on the account of their belief system. So the minority as a group is not protected in a liberal constitutional democracy. Minority as a group is not protected. The individuals of the minority community are protected. Now this is interesting, and this takes us back to the idea of state. If I'm not wrong, the John Locke and in fact Thomas Hobbes, in their writings, they have indicated that religion should not play any role in the state system. And particularly, and I am here referring to Professor Muhammad Fadel from University of Toronto. According to him, both Hobbes and Locke, they shared the opinion that Catholicism and Islam should not be allowed to be part of state system because of their transnational character. So if you allow religions to operate in public space, you will not be able to control the territory or the individuals because it has a transnational character. So in order to have control over territory and people, you will have to define state. Without religion, you will have to push religion back into the private space. Now, how is minority identified in a liberal constitutional democracy? Now, the post-colonial national state. Now, when I say post-colonial national state, there are many terms here that are used. One thing that we need to understand, that the one of the remnants of colonialism is the legal and political system that the colonial states adopted. Now, if you look at, for instance, Egypt, there is a wonderful study on the growth of liberalism in Egypt, which says that the Egyptian legal system was to a great extent influenced by the French legal system because Egypt was a French colony for a long period of time. And in fact, the very idea of codification of laws, the codification of personal laws, began one of the one of the earliest examples of this is in Egypt, when Abdul Razak al-Sanhuri, who was trained in France, he came back and he tried to codify the law, and it was on his model that the codification happened in many other states, including Algeria, Egypt, Syria, Iraq. He was personally responsible. Now, similar is the case with India. The Indian political system, the Indian legal system is rooted in the British system. Of course, we have taken ideas from other countries as well, but fundamentally, this is what we are. Indian legal system is a common law system. So, and common law system, when you look at these legal systems, they talk about a national state. Now, what does it mean by national state? National state means that there should be one nationality in a state. So when I say nationality is belongingness to a group, the entire population shall be looked at as one single group, and you will be a member of that group. So in that sense, you will be a national of that group of which the state is the representative. So of course, the idea of post-colonial national state is then rooted in a homogeneous national identity. So you cannot say that I am a Muslim or I am a Christian or I am a Dalit. Probably you may get benefits out of these identifications, but at the end of the day, you will always be an Indian. I remember I was having a talk back in 2015, 16. I was teaching at National Law University, Kolkata, and we were having a discussion, and I argued that the Indian courts are inherently biased. And then the other person said, well, that's a very strong statement. And then I had to say, well, that's not a strong statement. That's what the reality is, because the court has to maintain its fidelity to the constitution. And constitution talks about a national identity. So of course, whenever I go to the court, I go as an Indian before the court. But my question is, can I go as a Muslim before the court? Now, this is where the situation becomes a little messy, because if there is a contestation between your Muslim identity and Indian identity, the court is always going to prefer your Indian identity over your Muslim identity, and that is what is happening in all the personal law situations in India. So that's what it is. And this homogenization of national identity is presumed. There is a presumption that there will be an assimilation and homogenization. So all the different identities, they will come together and they will slowly melt and they will become one. So that's a very interesting hypothesis. And unfortunately, that hypothesis has failed, very much like the statement or the reasoning of Max Weber when he said that in the face of science, religion will go away. Now that's what Max Weber thought, that with science coming up, people will leave religion. So that's an interesting hypothesis. This is again an interesting hypothesis which has failed to live up to its expectations. Again, the minority identity is protected against the touchstones of equality and non-discrimination. That's a very interesting point. We shall discuss this a little later into the discussion. And again, the next point, again, we are going to discuss it. It's again very interesting, where the minority rights are construed to foster educational and cultural rights only. They are not the very idea of self-determination of minority rights or self-determination of minority. It's a very, very big threat to national identity as it is thought by the majority. So the minority's right to determine itself is not allowed usually in a liberal constitutional democracy. Now, I'm reminded again of the Egyptian system. For a period of time, earlier there were Sharia courts in Egypt, and then when liberalism started to seep in, there was a stage when they had mixed courts. It's a very interesting example, mixed courts. So in mixed courts, you had people trained in modern law, positive law, and then you had people trained in Sharia. Then you had people trained in Christian law, and all of these people used to sit together as judges. So it was a mixed court, and the jurisdiction was also based on that, and the identity of the individuals was kept intact. In fact, when Britishers came to India and they took control of the presidency towns of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, as they were known at that point of time, they maintained the identity of individuals, the identity of groups before the state by safeguarding the religious laws. So that was a practice. However, under liberal constitutional democracy, that is not the practice. And one interesting example is Article 44 of the Indian Constitution, which talks about uniform civil code. Now, why do you want a uniform civil code? Because you look at homogenization as the future. Now, interestingly, if I'm not wrong, Delhi High Court has proposed for a uniform civil code. I don't think that's going to work anymore. Now, how international law deals with the case of minorities. Now, let's look at the conceptual framework. The assertion is that international law played a key role in the making of a post-colonial liberal state. It was international law that played a key role. How did it do? By using law. Now, one of the interesting arguments about law, when you look at law from a critical perspective, people, there are scholars who say that law in a political situation, in a political scenario, when you have individuals who want their freedom,
Excuse me, sir.
and yes,
If
ma'am,
I may interrupt, your slides are not moving, sir. It's still the first page. Can you please also change the slides while you speak?
I'm
Thank you.
changing the slides. I am.
But sir, we are only able to see the first slide.
No, no, no. I'm changing the slide. Let me try
Sure,
this once again.
sure, sure.
I am changing the slides. Let me know if is it visible now?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And sorry for interrupting.
No, no, no problem. But then how do I change it? Okay, let me see. How do I change the slide then?
Sir, you will have to click on the slide on the left panel.
No, I'm doing it. It's saying stop sharing. So I'll stop sharing. I'll again share.
Okay.
Share screen, share screen, and then I have this screen. So is it visible now?
Sir, it is switching. Yes, sir, it is.
So I'm at the international and conceptual framework.
Yes, sir. If you can just click on the second slide, I'll just tell you whether it is transitioning into the second one. Just to
Is
check.
it working?
I'm only able to see the conceptual framework slide.
It's not working.
It is working, but I'm not. If you're in case you are changing it to the next slide, I am
I'm
unable to
changing.
see that.
I'm changing slides.
No, no, I can't see. It is still that only.
Now that's a problem. Then how do I do that? I'm sharing it as it needs to be shared.
I think before every slide you can just say share slide. I'm sorry for that. I don't know what the glitch is. If you can do that, I'll
Let
add it
me.
to stream every time.
Screen sharing is okay. Let me see. No, not the entire screen. I'll do this again.
Sure, sure.
So I'll stop sharing it and then I'll share it again if that
Sure.
is the case.
Yeah, yes,
Okay,
sir.
no
Thanks.
problem. Yeah, you're welcome. So when you look at when you look at the way the states were created using the template of, as I said earlier, liberal constitutional democracy, where the colonizers had gone. So the entire political system, legal system, in fact, that is a borrowed system. And then you have certain changes in that. And when you have the nation building project, the most important point is how to reconcile the two forces. One is nationalism and the other is liberal universalism. Now, again, the word liberal universalism is used because, and of course, this is part of my PhD as well, where I'm talking about multiplicity of universalisms. So, my universalism is probably different from your universalism. We both talk about it, but we both talk about it in different sense. So, my worldview might be different from your worldview. So these states had a big challenge to balance nationalism with liberal universalism. Why? Because when you look at nationalism, nationalism talks about assertion of identity. It talks about assertion of identity. It does not talk about homogenization of identities. It never talks about it. Universalism will talk about one identity, one set of rights, one set of freedoms, and one set of understanding about the future. So that's what universalism is going to tell you. But when you look at nationalism, that's not what nationalism is. Because if you look at the freedom struggle, there were different groups who fought. For example, there was a group of Bhagat Singh, there was a group of Subhash Chandra Bose, then there was Indian National Congress. Now, had Subhash Chandra Bose's group been successful, being dominant in gaining independence for India, then India probably would have got a different understanding, a different shape. So all of these had an understanding of nationalism. Their understanding might have been different as well. So there is a contestation. A nation building project, what it does is it tries to reconcile both of them by, as I said, by saying that identity is only one identity, and that is a national identity, nothing else. So this is what has happened. Nationalism brought people together by saying that we are all nationals of this place, we all belong to this place. And then the constitutional architecture, it allowed the states to adopt it and create something to govern this one entity. Now, George Herbert Mead is an interesting sociologist and psychologist. He wrote way back in 1920s an article on, in fact, a series of articles on nationalism and internationalism. And the argument he makes is very interesting. He says the purest form of action that can evoke nationalism is war and nothing else. It is the war that actually brings people together and arouses the element of nationalism in the people. So you can look at it in the post 9/11 scenario when US attacked, targeted Al Qaeda and then attacked Afghanistan as well. So the very idea was the entire nation was under threat. And then with the establishment of United Nations in 1940s, you have things coming into shape. So United Nations is talking about human rights, it is talking about citizenship, it is saying that no one should be left stateless. And then it is talking about the same set of freedoms which liberalism and talks about and constitutionalism tries to protect. And it also tries to discuss minorities, but at a very minimal level. We'll come to that as well in a little while. So the post-World War II liberal individualist approach to self-determination and minority protection in international law is shaped by the liberal constitutional architecture of post-colonial states. Now, this is what Muhammad Shahabuddin from the University of Birmingham, it's a recent book that he has written in 2021, that's what he argues. I'll move on to the next slide. I'll have to share it again. Okay, so if you look at the minority rights in India, this is the history of minority rights in India. We move quickly to the Indian context. The Motilal Nehru Committee report of 1928, it included minority rights as ground rules for the constitution. When I say ground rules, it means one of the fundamental rules to decide the shape of the constitution. Similar was the cabinet mission plan, which provided that the cessation of power to India from Britain would be subject to adequate safeguards for the protection of minorities. Now, please remember that both of these are informed by the identification of Muslims and Hindus primarily, and then the identification of Christians, Sikhs, and other people. Of course, linguistic minorities are also there. But the cabinet mission plan is talking about the India-Pakistan scenario when you are talking about two different identities. And when you are saying that there will be certain minorities in both the countries, so it's saying that the cessation of power shall be subject to the protection of minorities. Similarly, when Nehru, moved the objectives resolution for the constitution, again, it provided adequate safeguard to minorities. And of course, other groups were there as well. And then when Sardar Patel, he was chairman of the advisory committee on minorities, he talked about minority representation in legislatures as a political safeguard of their rights. So what I'm hinting at is the Parliament of India is having certain seats reserved for minorities. So that's what it is hinting at. The Parliament or the state legislatures, they will have certain seats that will be reserved for minorities. Of course, we have seats for Anglo-Indians and other groups, but as of now, there are no seats reserved for minorities using the term minority. I'll come to the next slide now. Unfortunately, this is going to take a little more time, but anyways. Now, the entire scenario changed. The entire scene actually changed with the decision of Pakistan coming into picture. So when you understood that Pakistan is going to be created based on Muslim identity, the entire mood in the Constituent Assembly changed. For instance, I have noted down several observations here by M.R. Masani. You can go to Constituent Assembly debates on the dates I have provided, and you can look at these statements. M.R. Masani, P.S. Deshmukh, Renuka Ray, and even Ambedkar talked in favor of a homogeneous national identity and against the continuation of the minority identity. Now, Ambedkar is a very interesting person in this context because he was championing the Dalit identity. But interestingly, he never championed Dalit identity as a minority identity. He always championed Dalit identity as a group identity. That's it. So he was not pitching it as minority majority. So when he got the minority, when he got the Dalit identity recognized, he did not argue in favor of a minority identity. Similarly, the advisory committee of the Constituent Assembly, it presented its report in 1949, and in its report, it observed that there should be no provision for the reservation of seats for religious minorities. It said it very categorically. Now, interestingly, the seats could be reserved for tribal groups, scheduled castes, etc., on the basis of their socio-economic backwardness. So Ambedkar is talking about group rights on the basis of backwardness. So these groups, they got their representation based on socio-economic backwardness. However, none of them were called as a minority. So the word minority, which was one of the ground rules for the constitution, it got changed over a period of time, and as we will see, it got extinguished in the end. So that's what the situation was. And I'm moving on to the next slide. This is not, of course, this is not working. Give me a moment. Okay. And then we move towards the extinction of minority rights. So the situation changed and people started not to argue about minority rights. So now we have statements coming from the members of the Constituent Assembly who were not in favor of minority rights. Let us look at Begum Rasool. In 1949, she says, "It is very necessary that the Muslims living in this country should throw themselves entirely upon the goodwill of the majority community." Sardar Patel, he says, "The future of a minority, any minority, is to trust the majority. If the majority misbehaves, it will suffer." Nehru in 1949 says ultimately the only way to proceed is to remove every barrier which separates majority and minority in the political domain so that they may develop and we may all work together. Now, this was in against the minority right. Now, put against this view, Hukam Singh's view, which is very interesting and which appeals as well to an extent. He says even the aggressiveness of the majority would pass off as nationalism, while the helplessness of the minority might be dubbed as communalism. Well, the entire Corona Jihad debate, the entire debate on Tablighi Jamaat, it's an indication of this. It's very easy for the majority to preach nationalism to the minorities, but it is very difficult to act upon it. So there is a strong statement telling us that minority rights are absolutely essential. I'll move on to the next slide. Now, interestingly, when Nehru talked about the ground rules for reservation of seats, and then the other members also supported it, they were also supporting reservation of minorities in public services. So that was also there. So once the minority reservation from parliament was taken away, the reservation in public jobs was also taken away, and the only reservation that remained was based on the basis of backwardness. So the reservation that article 15 talks about, 15, 16 talk of the Indian constitution talks about, are based on backwardness. And of course the reservation for women is based on, not based on backwardness, it's based on gender. And then interestingly, the part 16 of the constitution, the title of part 16 was special provisions relating to minorities. The word minority was replaced from there to certain classes. So part 16 of the constitution as of now talks about special provisions relating to certain classes. The idea about minority representation in legislature was finally dropped, and of course this brought an end to a discussion on the protection of national minorities. Now, as I said earlier, one of the fundamental features of minority rights is the right to self-determination. And when you have right to self-determination, you have the right to self-determination at the national level. As I hinted at, when I can go, it would be if I can go to the court both as an Indian, as a Muslim. If I cannot go as a Muslim before the court, then I am not accepted as a minority, as a religious minority. So this is an important aspect, that minority identification should happen at the national level. Then only you can talk about real minority rights. Otherwise, the minority rights end up being called as group rights. I'll move on to the next slide. Let us look at the Constituent Assembly debates. What do the Constituent Assembly debates say about the rights of minorities? Article 29.1, the present Article 29.1. The original article was Article 23.1. Now, please have a look at it. There are three things here: original article, draft article, and adopted article. So originally the article was drafted in this way, the article was finalized in this way, and then the article was adopted in a different way. So if you look at the original article, the terms that are used are minorities in every unit. When the article was put into the drafting stage, minorities in every unit was replaced by any section of the citizens. So the word minority is gone. And the protection shall be on the basis of language, script, and culture. So if you look at the draft article, the language, script, and culture remains there. So they both are maintained. And As I said, any section of citizens is also maintained in the final article. The interesting part is the language of Article 23.1, the original one, which was to be debated. Now, it said that no laws or regulations may be enacted that may operate oppressively or prejudicially in this respect. So, which means it said that there cannot be any laws that oppress or discriminate against minorities. So that was a very strong statement, creating a standard for laws. You cannot create a law. It's like the present situation wherein the constitution says the legislature cannot make a law which violates the fundamental rights of citizens. Now this argument is similar. The legislature cannot make a law that violates the minority identity or minority rights. Now, if you look at the transition goes to, it's diluted to the extent where you are talking about the conservation of the minority rights, the right to conserve the same. They're not talking about, so it's like you have removed the entire canines. The minority rights is left only with jaw, with no teeth. So of course you cannot eat. So you do not have any biting part. So that was the situation. That is how it came up before the Constituent Assembly. And then you have the Article 29.2, the present Article 29.2 in the Constitution. It was originally 23.2 of the draft article. Now, if you compare the draft article 23.2 with 29.2, 23.2 says no minority can be discriminated. Now, 29.2, the present article says no citizen shall be discriminated. That's one thing. Second is, if you look at the minority rights here, they talk about educational institutions, admission into educational institution. There shall not be any discrimination for educational admission into educational institution. Now that is retained, admission into an educational institution. And as we will see a little while later, that minority rights were started to be understood in terms of culture and in terms of their preservation. And the idea of national minority, of course, was dropped at the beginning. The language, that's just an information thing. It was proposed by Thakur Das Bhargav, and then it was voted and it was adopted. The original Article 29.2. And then we have Article 30 of the Indian Constitution, which talks about the right of minorities to establish, administer educational institutions. Now look at the draft article and look at the adopted article. In the draft article, the language was all minorities based on religion, community, or language. Now, in the adopted article, the word community was taken away. Now, the members, they argued that, community would mean nothing. Either the people will belong to particular religion, particular language. That's it. How can you identify minorities based on community identity? So, the word, the relic, that could have any space for the minority identity that you could have used, the word community could have used, but the community was again removed on the suggestion of Thakur Das Bhargav on December 8, 1948. Let's move on. So then we have the right of minorities to establish, administer educational institutions, Article 30, Clause 2. There again, nothing much. The word religion, community, or language was changed into religion or language. So the present article of the Constitution, Article 30, Clause 2, it talks only about religion and language. It doesn't talk about community. Now, again, it is Thakurdas Bhargav who is behind this amendment. Now, this is with respect to the rights of minorities to identify themselves. Now, what about the religious identification? Look at the Article 25, the current Article 25 of the Indian Constitution, which talks about the freedom of conscience and freedom profession and the free profession, practice, and propagation of religion. If you look at it, the draft article that was before the Constituent Assembly was Article 19.1, wherein it talks about, there was actually no difference. I don't think there was any difference. The original article was adopted as the final article. No difference was made on this. And of course, there is no mention of minority or community in this article. What is important here are two things before I move on to the next slide. The idea of freedom of religion being given to people, persons. So the very idea of religion becomes individual. So religion is very often, very easily pushed into the private space of individuals. Now, I remember I was having a discussion with one of my friends, and then we were discussing the scope of religion, and I had to tell him that, if you look at Islam, you cannot talk about religion in personal space. The reason is the religion dictates you to offer namaz, prayers in congregation 5 times a day. That's what it is. If you're not able to offer in congregation, you can offer it alone, but it is better to offer in congregation. So if you are offering prayer in congregation, religion does not remain a personal affair, it becomes a community affair. So this is one thing. And then the other thing is the idea of equality. So in terms of the freedom of religion, you will be going to be understood against the touchstone of equality, whether you are treated equally or not. And of course, that is what the entire debate on throwing open the doors of temples in South India as it is happening, or women going to mazars and all of this debate is informed by the element of equality and individuality. So you have it here, and then we move on to Article 26, which talks about religious affairs. Now, what does Article 26 talk about? It says that every religious denomination or any section thereof shall have the right. It was a long section, so I did not include it completely. The draft Article 20, it said that every religious denomination or any section. The only thing that was added in the article, which is the current article, is subject to public order, morality, and health. So I don't think that has any relevance for whatever we are discussing here today. Now, coming to the crux of today's lecture, and that is, did international law play any role? Let us look at the historical perspective. Let us look at things in the historical perspective. A subcommission was instituted in the United Nations on the prevention of discrimination and the protection of minorities. There was a subcommission that was instituted. It held its first session on December 6, 1947. Now, what was the purpose for which the subcommission was instituted? It was instituted to, as I have mentioned it here, to participate in drawing of relevant provisions on what? Prevention of discrimination on grounds of race, sex, language, or religion, and the protection of minorities. So, one of the agendas before the subcommission was the protection of minorities. Now, I would request you to focus on the term discrimination. And then, so we go back to the original, the original statement that I made, that minority rights are seen as rights through the prism of equality and non-discrimination. The subcommission argued that the Declaration and Convention on Human Rights must contain relevant provisions for the prevention of discrimination and the protection of minorities. Now, we must understand that when United Nations was established in 1945, two things were very, very important before the United Nations. In fact, they did three things which are very important. One, United Nations at the very beginning, it made the intention that we are not going to discuss war because we have just come out of war. So United Nations does not focus on war. So the entire international law corpus that talks about war, for example, the Geneva Conventions on the treatment of civilians, on the treatment of prisoners of war, 1, 2, 3, 4, the four Geneva Conventions of 1949, they were not codified under the aegis of United Nations because United Nations is not going to discuss war. United Nations is also not going to discuss war, and therefore the only element that United Nations discusses with respect to nuclear energy is the use of nuclear energy for useful purposes. It does not discuss the issue of nuclear weapons. It never discusses that. That's one thing. The other thing is the United Nations wanted to prohibit the mass killing of people. And in this regard, they were informed by the experience of the killing of Jews in Germany. And it is for that reason that United Nations wanted to take certain action. And that is how the Genocide Convention of 1948 came into existence. And then the third thing was United Nations wanted to focus on the human rights of individuals, which is positive rights, giving people certain rights. Now, and therefore they talked about Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, if you look at this debate, this is 1947 and it's also in 1946, and UDHR is 1948. Now, there is a story behind UDHR. United Nations wanted to create a convention on human rights, an overarching convention on human rights, and before that, a declaration on human rights. So they wanted a declaration on human rights and then a convention on human rights. However, the countries had different notions of human rights. For example, the capitalist countries, they had a different notion. The socialist countries, they had a different notion. For capitalist countries, the civil and political rights were important. And for the socialist countries, the economic, social, and cultural rights were important. So they were not able to agree on any definition. And that is why what they did was they came up with Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then they said, let's this be the template, and based on this template we will develop human rights treaties, human rights instruments later. And that is how they ended up developing the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, both of 1966. So what we are discussing here is pre-UDHR era, 1947. So the subcommission, in its view, is the Declaration and Convention on Human Rights that was proposed, and of course that could not happen. And similar was the case with, and I'm going a little away from the topic, but that's a side note. Similar was the case with the trade law. They wanted to create, the international community wanted to create an international trade organization back in 1940s. 1946-47, they could not do that, and therefore they had to come up with general agreement on tariff and trade 1947, and the WTO only could come in 1995 through Marrakesh agreement. So anyways, that's just a side note, not even a footnote. And then the subcommission recommended the inclusion clauses that condemn incitement to violence against religious groups, nations, races, or minorities. Now, on this issue, if anyone of you is interested, he or she should follow some of the interesting works by Mohsin Alam Bhatt, who works on hate crimes, who runs a hate crimes clinic. He is based in General Global Law School. So he tries to look at the incitement of violence against minorities. So it's an interesting corpus of work that he's trying to develop. And then we have the other set of arguments that come up before us in the same context. The subcommission also requested the inclusion of clauses. Now, this is again interesting. The subcommission says that if there are any peace treaties that are going to be signed, please include clauses on minority rights in those treaties. Now, what are peace treaties? For instance, look at the Treaty of Versailles in early 1990s, 1920s. That's the Treaty of Versailles. Many people do not know it is the Treaty of Versailles that established the International Labour Organization. And it was the Treaty of Versailles that infuriated Hitler, saying that my country was humiliated by pushing it into the signing the Treaty of Versailles. But anyways, the Treaty of Versailles was understood as a peace treaty. Now, the subcommission also argued, in fact, it proposed that when there are ethnic, linguistic, or religious groups, and they want a differential treatment, they want their identity to be kept intact, that needs to be maintained. And there needs to be the establishment of schools, cultural, and religious institutions that could maintain the identity. So again, the subcommission is talking about the cultural rights, the non-discrimination and equality rights as minority rights. They are not at all talking about minority rights as self-determination rights, because they think that self-determination is going to be problematic. I'm sorry. Yes. And then let us look at it further. What does it say? And then you look at the decision of the subcommission. Now, I had to copy paste it here. In fact, I had to take a snapshot and paste it here because it's a long para, but it's an important para. Now, it says that it tries to define, minority rights in terms of non-discrimination and, of course, equality. And then it talks about differential treatment. It's saying again the same thing, that the differential treatment to minorities should be preserved if they want to, because otherwise they cannot be protected. Now, that's what the argument says. We move on further. Let us look at India's position in response to these suggestions at international level. Now, it's interesting, the Indian representative in the Human Rights Commission was in favor of minorities. The Indian representative made a statement in 1947 in the favor of minorities, and it cautioned against the cultural assimilation of minorities. However, later India changed its stand. Of course, as we saw earlier, probably because of the creation of Pakistan. The Commission on Human Rights in its third session, in this session, India, China, and UK they supported the deletion of any provision on the protection of minorities. And of course, this is the draft Declaration on Human Rights or the draft convention, which could not come into existence, which got converted into Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, Mrs. Mehta, who was representing India at that point of time, she said, since human rights were to be enjoyed equally by all, there was no need to grant special rights to minority groups. So here she is talking about individual rights and not group rights. We move on further. Let's see what more happened at United Nations. The UN Subcommission on Minority Rights in 1950, it tried to define who is a minority. So it says minorities are the ones that possess and wish to preserve their identity, their traditions or characteristics markedly different from those of the rest of the population. So what you are seeing here is actually a relative identification. I am different, I should be protected because I am different from other set of people. So there the identification is based in relative sense here. Now, similar was the case with UN Declaration on Minorities and the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe document on national minorities. They all talked about minorities in terms of ethnic, religious, linguistic, and religious identity. Now, Shahabuddin has an interesting argument to make here. He says this kind of a treatment to minorities, I'll read the entire quote here. It's an interesting take. It understands minority as a group in a subordinate position, which has at its core certain ethnic features that the members of the group not only share, but also intend to preserve as an insignia of their identity. In this sense, the minority is not only the other of the majority within a given polity because of its distinctive ethnic features, but also the other of liberal universalism due to its tendency to portray its self-image in ethnic terms. So what does he say? He hints at the following thing. Whenever you say that a minority is a group that is different from the rest of the population, then you are focusing on the idea of otherness. Now, if you look at the entire debate on, again, I'm going back to Corona Jihad, and if you look at the Tablighi Jamaat case, it is the otherness that is being hinted at. So if you are talking about minority in terms of its relationship with the majority, then you have an understanding that this is us and these are others. So that's one thing that is creating problem here, the way it is defined in international law. It came to be defined in international law. And then it also comes in contestation with the universalism. Why? Because you have already said that this is something different and this is something that needs to be preserved, that needs to be, they need to preserve themselves. So if I am preserving myself, my identity, my religion, then in essence, I cannot be part of the universal identity. It's not possible. So if you are framing minority identity as an identity different from the majority and an identity that needs to be preserved, then I cannot participate in both the spaces. As against majority, I will always be an other, and as against the universal tendencies, I will always be looked at as someone who is self-interested. So I would be looked at as someone who opposes the very idea of universalism. So now we move on to the next element, which is how we understand the identity more in this sense. Again, Shahabuddin very, very clearly he says that instead of looking at minority as an isolated object with certain distinctive features, you could have looked at it that way. What you end up doing is you end up looking at it in relative sense. And in its relative sense, what happens is, as I have already hinted at, you will always talk about its uneven relationship with the majority. And then you will always talk about the different ideology that it follows against universalism. Now, this is a very typical argument that is made in the context of Muslim identity in India. You belong to India or not? Do you follow Indian culture? Whether you are an Indian, that's a debate. And then look at the populist politics that is happening today. You have to, the minorities should live according to the wishes of the majority. So that is the entire idea. If you define minority in terms of its relative existence, and what Shahabuddin writes is absolutely correct, that the minority is consistently defined and understood as distinct as well as primitive. So I sometimes wonder, Muslims have been here in India for, if I'm not wrong, for several centuries. Of course, I'm not wrong. So Muslims have been in India for several centuries. And how could you see the beard and the skull cap as something distinct? How could you be surprised by looking at the beard and the skull cap? The Indian experience is very different from European experience, because it it is today that people are moving into Europe. So for them it's a new thing, but for India it's not a new thing. It is never distinct, because Muslims have been in this country for centuries. Even they have ruled the state for centuries. So that's what it is. And then a couple of more slides and then I will stop. I'll be happy to take up questions if there are any. Now, in the, you know, Commission on Human Rights, several countries made their observations. So I have noted them down for the audience. Australia and Syria, they argued against the minority protection. They saying that it is not a problem. USSR and Yugoslavia, they also said that it is not a problem. No, absolutely not. Not the USSR and Yugoslavia. They actually said in a something different, and that is what. I'm sorry, I took I misquoted it. They argued in a different sense. Let me come to their argument. What the Yugoslavia and USSR they said on this. And of course, India said that it does not support the minority rights. So India was also of the opinion. And along with India, US and UK, they were also of the opinion that minority rights should not be protected under the name of minorities. USSR and Yugoslavia, they had very interesting claims to make. They supported minority rights, and this is what the representatives had to say. They said in order to ensure the protection of the individuals who formed a community, that community must first of all be recognized and protected so that collective efforts can be made to create the necessary conditions for the enjoyment of those rights. So it is like the way Iqbal, Allama Iqbal or Muhammad Iqbal, the poet, he says, फर्द कायम रब्ते मिल्लत से है तन्हा कुछ नहीं मौज है दरिया में बैरून दरिया कुछ नहीं. So what he says is an individual's identity is rooted in the community, just in the same manner as the water belongs to the ocean. So if water comes on the shore, it has no value. But if it goes into the ocean, it has all the value. It can create life and it can do many things. So फर्द कायम रब्ते मिल्लत से है, तन्हा कुछ नहीं. An individual in himself or herself is nothing. He or she belongs to the community. मौज है दरिया में, बैरून दरिया कुछ नहीं. The entire energy, the tide is in the ocean. It is not there when the water spills on the seashore. So you're not talking about an individual, you're talking about individual rooted in a community. Now this is again the representative. They say that equality of individuals was impossible without the equality of the national groups to which they belonged. So if you look at it here, the very idea is national identity, the identification of national groups. So what we end up understanding is that the liberal individualist human rights approach was considered finally because nations did not accept that minority rights should be protected in that sense. Now keep in mind that these developments are happening alongside the debates that are happening in the Constituent Assembly. So these developments are happening in 47, 48, 49. Similarly, the debates are happening in the Constituent Assembly in 47, 48, and 49. And then just one more, I'll take one more slide and then I'll stop.
Sure,
Any
sir.
questions? If there are any questions, I would love
Yes.
to read them.
Sorry to interrupt you, sir. You can complete this slide, then we will have a discussion. I'm sure there would be a couple of questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And this is the last one. These were the stands taken by the countries in the United Nations. Now I'm trying to focus on some of the interesting ones. Now Britain argued that there would be a progress of civilization, and the progress of civilization cannot happen unless there is an assimilation with the majority. So if you look at the Constituent Assembly debate, the Constituent Assembly debate also goes in the same way. It also talks about the assimilation of the majority. If you look at the statements by Patel, Nehru that I quoted, they talk about the assimilation. And then Australia also says assimilation was the only solution. Egypt also had the same standings. It said that the perpetuation of identity and rights of minorities, the identity and rights of minorities cannot be taken till perpetuity. We will have to stop it somewhere. Chile did not have any problem with the identification of minorities, but it raised objection with special rights given to minorities. So in a sense, it was against. India also agreed, and India argued that the protection of minorities would impede common national life. So if you look at the Constituent Assembly debates, of course, they are in line with what is happening at the United Nations at that point of time. And therefore, we can say that the minority rights was sealed with the unified national state. So you will have one national identity. Of course, we have not discussed territorial integrity. That's not part of the discussion, but anyways, that is important because territorial integrity, it is the territories that are defining legal and illegal persons. I wanted to discuss the idea of citizenship as well, but then I thought it would be too long and I should not go into that much of detail. So I left it. But the entire idea of legality and illegality, legal persons, illegal persons, the idea of nationals, the idea of refugees, the idea of Rohingyas, Tamil refugees, these are all connected to the idea of territorial integrity and national security. So when you cross the territory, you are into another state, and if you do not have a visa and a passport, then you are an illegal migrant. And then the liberal individualist framework of rights. The minority rights was construed in United Nations and then of course in the Indian Constitution through the liberal individualist lens and not as a group identity that needs to be safeguarded in itself. Shahabuddin observes that minority was therefore eventually conceived as a backward parochial connotation, a constant threat to the liberal state. So that is where we end up with the entire debate on citizenship, the entire debate on Citizenship Amendment Act, the entire debate on Shaheen Bagh, the entire debate on arrests being made, the entire debate on the religious identity. It boils down to what I discussed today, that is the way we construe minority identity in a liberal constitutional democracy, and more particularly in India. So I'll stop here. If you have, I leave the floor to you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. It was really a wonderful and thought-provoking talk. In fact, it opens up various technical uh, confusions that we have in our day-to-day discussions, including the masses and the intellectual masses. So you have covered most of the things, starting from nation to international perspectives on this topic of my minority. I am sure there are a couple of questions that I would like you to respond to. Riba, I'm not able to see the questions that you are posting on screen. Yeah, one question is, why can't Muslim in India go to court as Indian Muslim rather than just Indian?
Well, that's an interesting case. See,
I
that's
think
that's
one more
really very
line was
interesting.
there. To add to this line, there was one more line that, why do we need to pursue the idea of India or Indian, which has been projected by select nationalist groups? Why do we
Okay.
need to borrow that idea? Why can't India be uh, included with other groups as well? Please.
See, the first question is that, it's very interesting for me. The reason is, some time back, I tried to start a blog with the title of Indian Muslim. I started the blog with Indian Muslim, and I try to put up some of the things that I write over there. Unfortunately, since a month or so, I have not been able to do it because of my research commitments, but that's the exact topic I try to address over there. If you ask me, I would say the idea of an Indian Muslim needs to be reconsidered, and you will have to, in a sense, redefine the Muslim identity in India. You will have to. You cannot go back to the Constituent Assembly debate and say this is what Indian Muslims are. You will have to go back. You will have to make an attempt to redefine. Now, coming back to the question, why can't a Muslim in India go to the court as an Indian Muslim rather than just Indian? Of course, you can go to the court as an Indian Muslim. Of course, for instance, you go to the court for a woman goes to the court for the annulment of her marriage under Muslim law. So, of course, she is going there as an Indian Muslim. Now, my argument is not that you cannot go as an Indian Muslim. My argument is, when you have two different identities at your disposal, how does the court negotiate between the conflicting identities? So, there may arise a situation where the national identity conflicts with the Muslim identity. For example, if a man marries more than one woman, now the Islamic law allows more than one woman, but the law of the land does not allow more than one woman. The law of the land, it actually punishes bigamy. Now, if such kind of a case goes before the court, what the court is going to do. That's my question, because you have conflicting ideas coming from two different identities. My argument is the court will always be biased in favor of the constitutional identity. It will always be biased. The reason is it has to maintain its fidelity to the constitution, because the court is the product of the constitution. It is the constitution that has established the court. So the court will always do that. And if this continues, what will happen is your, in the longer run, your religious identity in terms of personal laws is going to be diluted at the hands of the court, because in its view, it is the liberal identity that it is going to impose. It is not going to impose the religious identity, because it has the fidelity to the towards the constitution. So of course you can go as an Indian Muslim, but what I'm saying is that doesn't work in the longer run. Uh, the second question I just missed. If Dr. Shuja, you can help me with the second one.
Was
Yes.
in relation to the same first question, why do we need to
Yes.
borrow and accept the idea of India as it is being interpreted by select nationalist groups?
See, I'm not saying that you have to borrow the idea. First of all, when the idea of India, I remember now, this is an interesting anecdote that I would like to share. When I was teaching in class, I think third year law students were there, and I made a statement that India before 1947. One of the students raised his hand and said, "So there was no India before 1947." I was silent for a moment. I thought about it, and then I say, well, probably you are true. In terms of the constitution, in terms of the state, of course, there was no India on paper. There was no India. India and Pakistan, they both came into existence in 1947 together. You could have an idea of India. You could say that there was an idea of Hindustan or Bharat, but to say that India as a state existed, no, it did not exist before it got independence from the Britishers. So when you talk about Indian identity, if you look at the Constituent Assembly debates, that's what I have highlighted as well. The debate goes in favor of a national identity. So you will have to follow a national identity. Now, assume that what you're doing is the national identity idea is already there. So there is already a glass of water that is there on the table. So national, and you are thirsty. The only thing that you have to do is to twist it in a manner that works for you. So the very idea of national identity already exists. What you're trying to do is you are trying to give it substance. So the substance that was given at the Constituent Assembly was liberal constitutionalism. Now with the populist government of today, it is given a different substance. So national identity remains there. The very substance that drives that national identity becomes different. And this is what the very idea of populism is all about. Ernest Laclau and many others, they have written that the very idea of populism is a hollow idea. Populism has to, in order to stand, populism borrows idea from somewhere. So it is on the national identity idea that populism is now running.
Yeah, wonderful, sir. In fact, this is the very need of the hour today, because the whole politics of hijacking the spaces and the whole notion of nationalism or nationalist or nation has been hijacked. I think what you said, that we need to reclaim those, I think if I could put it in this way, that we need to reclaim those spaces and try to project or reproject the idea of India and the idea of nationalism today. And what I again believe is that um, the two concepts in India are absolutely messy and absolutely understood in a very vague and ambiguous way, which are now being interpreted as the whims and fancies of the certain groups. Those concepts are the idea of nation and idea of culture.
Absolutely.
I think those two concepts are very much ambiguous, and through which many things are being politicized. So I think if you want to comment on this, you can comment, or else we will go for the next question, sir.
Yeah, I'll come to the next question. I'll have a
Yeah,
brief comment on this.
yeah, please.
When this entire anti-CAA protest was happening throughout the country, I visited many places. I have been a witness to the Shaheen Bagh protest. I have stayed there for a couple of days. If I'm not wrong, I stayed there for 2 weeks. I saw things on the ground. Now, see, if you have a Muslim woman coming out of the house, which is not the place for her in Muslim mindset, the place for a woman usually is understood to be the house. That's what people understand it. And the woman, she is moving out of her house, going to the public space. She is sitting over there, she is protesting in group, and then she holds the Indian constitution, or she talks about Ambedkar and Gandhi. Now this is the limit to which a Muslim woman can do. She cannot do anything more than this to show that she belongs to this country. She cannot do more than this. This is the limit of it. Now, if this can be portrayed in a communal angle, from a communal angle, then you must sit down and think what is going to happen with respect to the religious identity, because this is the end of it. You could not have done more than this. So that was my brief response. I tried to write a couple of pieces during that time, published
Yeah,
in the Hindustan Times and others. Anyways, coming to the
yeah.
next question.
Next question is, how do we contest the political coloring of law? How can we trust a law which can be modified or amended and framed by majority, which sometimes ends up suppressing minority? So whenever we talk about the minority, we take the shelter under the law, but certain laws which are absolutely amended and modified by majority, how could we do in this situation? I think this is the question.
It's very interesting. If you look at the writings of critical scholars, there is a particular group of scholars known as critical scholars. In law, you have them, they are, for instance, Unger, Roberto Mangibeira Unger is one, Duncan Kennedy is other, then Thomas Gable is the third one. These are the people who look into the critical perspective of law. Now, if you look at the critical perspective to law, you will understand that that's what I tried to hint at. I could not go much into detail on that point. There is a contestation between individual autonomy and democracy. There is an inherent contestation. The critical scholars, they are very clearly of the view that they both cannot exist. It is not possible, because these are two opposite ends. When you are talking about individual autonomy, how can you create a norm? Think about it. I am Shah Rukh Khan. I wear a t-shirt today, and then tomorrow I wear a suit, and then day after tomorrow I go to swimming. So you have three different pictures of Shah Rukh Khan in front of you, and then you say, what is the standard dress to be worn? You cannot decide it because of individual autonomy. If you say that all individuals are free and autonomous and they can choose whatever they want, then the practices will be so diverse, so liquid, that you cannot create a norm, you cannot create a standard. And that is why you end up having a chaotic mindset. You do not understand what is happening. So the scholars, they say individualism and democracy, they cannot exist in that sense. They cannot validate each other. You cannot validate individualism, individual liberty and autonomy against democracy, because democracy will always try to supersede individualism. Individualism will always try to suppress democracy. Look at all the protests that are happening for LGBT, for women's rights, for religious rights. What is happening? Individual rights, they are against the democratic system. That's what is happening. Now these critical scholars, they say that it is only law that mediates between individualism and democracy. It is only the instrument of law that actually mediates. The instrument of law was created only to give justification to the actions of democracy. So law becomes the language that justifies certain action. So it becomes the language in which you clothe anything. If you're talking about, your property is taken by someone, you go to the court, you clothe it in terms of law. You say my property rights are under stake. Okay. When someone has abused you by looking at your beard, you go to the court and say, well, I am being abused on the basis of my religious identity. So the entire discourse happens in the language of law. That is what allows both of them to coexist together. So you cannot take politics away from law. Absolutely, you cannot take it away. In fact, there are many people who say that law justifies two things. Number one, it justifies politics. So it justifies political interests. So if anyone has to say anything, he will clothe it in the language of law. And number two, law justifies the accumulation of wealth. The property rights are justified through the agency of law. For instance, look at the doctrine of eminent domain. The all lands belong to the state. From where does this come? The state can take away your property for any purpose. From where does this come? This comes from the right to property of the state using the agency of law.
So, thank you. It is interesting. And similar to this question, how do we tackle the situation like, let us say, in a country like India, wherein politics become a law, wherein in the case of, let us take an example of CAA, which has been contested when it was a CAB. It was a bill earlier presented in the houses, but then it turned out to be a law. But
Absolutely.
now today, if you talk against CAA, so you will be show cause and notice from your respective organizations, and it could be considered as an act against uh, to be to that extent a nation. So what is your take on this? How would we tackle this situation?
See, the only solution for you is to respond in the language in which things are being done. See, it's very interesting if you look at the work of, for instance, people who talk about justice, John Rawls, or if you look at the works of Habermas, they all talk about the idea of public reason. They say whatever we say in public, whenever we discuss anything, we should discuss it in the manner that everyone can understand and everyone can participate in. So that's the core argument that both Rawls and Habermas have. Now, you cannot, if you are speaking English, I cannot speak Chinese to you. It's not possible. The conversation will not happen.
No, you will be
So,
branded as an international.
yes. So in order to answer the question, if politics is being used to define law, the only agency that you have is politics to challenge law. You cannot challenge you cannot challenge law in any sense. If politics is happening in the legislature, then the only solution is for the politics to happen in public space. That is the only solution.
I think there was one more question, sir. Thank you for your comments. I think that was what are the rights of minorities? Uh, what are the constitutional rights of for minorities, linguistics and religious, sir?
Yes, I discussed that. I discussed that as part of Article 29 and 30. These are the minority rights in India.
Yeah.
Article 29 and 30. These are the only two provisions that talk about minorities.
Thank you, sir. Is there any other question, Ariba? Thank you, sir. It was really a wonderful session, and I'm sure people of India today and those who are curious to know about these debates will be definitely benefited after going through your lecture. And we will have more similar kind of talks. I think I forgot to introduce briefly about the heirs. Actually, uh, in fact, I would have mentioned this earlier, but just give me 2 minutes so that I will introduce briefly about the heirs. Uh, heirs is an association of Indian research scholars. We have been active since September 2020 and have successfully hosted eminent scholars including Noam Chomsky, Professor Nai, Joseph Nai, and Professor Hargopal Rajan Haresh, Professor Zoya Hassan, Professor Alam, Afroz Alam, Professor Muhammad Muazzam Ali, among others. We have also released 2 newsletters, which included not just webinar reports, but also opinion pieces by scholars from across India. If you have any piece you
Dr. Shuja, you are not audible.
I think, sir, there is some network issue and is at his end. I would like to thank you, sir. I'm very grateful to you that you have agreed to give a lecture on our forum, and it was a great learning experience to hear you talk today. Your lucid arguments and enthusiastic delivery and command over the topic gave us so much more insight into your knowledge and was very inspiring. Uh, I would also like to thank all the members who have worked tirelessly to make this event possible. A special mention of Aruna, Ajab, and Manasa. We at AIDS are also grateful for the support, enthusiasm, and determination of the speaker, participants, and team at AIDS. Thank you. We hope to see all of you on a 30-second webinar on July 17th on Situating the Local in Bilateral Relations by Surya Shankar Sen. Have a great day. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ariba. Thank you, Dr. Shujauddin. I learned a lot discussing with you people and enjoyed the session. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's been a wonderful experience.
thank you, sir. Thank you so much for joining. Am I audible, Ariba? Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please continue.
Ariba, you may stop the recording.